In the distant aftermath of an interstellar war, humanity has conquered many alien worlds, bringing a wave of fear and submission across the stars. But for Dan Harrow, a battle-hardened warrior, his most recent victory comes with an unexpected twist. Assigned an alien slave, Dan is unprepared for the spark of defiance in her eyes, a sign of something more than just another prize of war. Dan watched as she was brought forward, her movements restrained by thick iron chains. The alien girl, whose name, he learned, was Lyra, had skin that shimmered with an otherworldly blue hue, and her silver hair caught the dying rays of sunlight as if woven from strands of metal. Her expression was stoic, yet her intense gaze pierced through him, unyielding, as if silently challenging everything he stood for. As the guards released her into his care, Dan felt an odd mixture of pride and discomfort. Pride, because her people, once a formidable force against humanity, were now conquered. Discomfort, because he sensed something more within her, a quiet rebellion hidden beneath her silence. "On your feet," he barked, gripping the chains and giving a slight tug. But she didn't resist. Instead, she stood up with a grace that seemed almost defiant in its calmness. She kept her gaze steady, looking right at him, unflinching. Her lack of fear unsettled him. Most slaves would avert their eyes, cower, or at least show some sign of defeat. But Lyra only watched him with those intense eyes, as if studying him, as if peeling back the layers of his hardened exterior. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" he murmured, half to himself, half in disbelief. It was a foolish question. Of course she was. She had to be. To his surprise, she answered, her voice soft yet steady. "Fear. I've seen my world burn. I've seen my people fall. What's left for me to fear?" Dan felt a flicker of something he couldn't place. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was supposed to be a prize, a symbol of victory. Yet here she stood, unwavering, almost indifferent to her fate. He let go of the chains, stepping back as he gauged her stance. The desert wind whistled between them, carrying the distant echoes of their recent battle. Silence stretched out before them, and for the first time in years, Dan felt the emptiness of the wasteland around him. He was alone with this alien girl who seemed to hold no fear, no shame, only a strange, profound sadness mixed with defiance. "Tell me, warrior," she began, her voice tinged with a bitterness that sent a chill down his spine. "Does victory feel as sweet when you're standing alone, with only your own shadow for company?" Her words struck deep, even though he wanted to ignore them. He was a soldier, a survivor, and sentiment had no place on the battlefield. Yet, her question lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable. "You don't know anything about me," he replied gruffly, as if her words had merely grazed him. "Perhaps," she responded, her eyes narrowing slightly, "but I know the weight of chains, and I know the weight of pride." Their exchange was brief, but something had shifted. Dan found himself unwilling to shackle her like a mere animal, yet he knew the consequences if anyone saw him showing leniency. With a resigned sigh, he secured her chain loosely, letting her walk beside him, not trailing far behind as a slave might. As they began to move, Lyra cast a final look over her shoulder at the barren landscape, her gaze distant, as though she were bidding farewell to something unseen. Dan felt an odd pang at her expression, a sense of loss that wasn't his, yet somehow he understood it. They walked in silence, the dimming light casting long shadows around them. He was a hardened warrior with no time for reflection, but with each step beside this strange, unbroken captive, he felt his own armor cracking, just a little, and for reasons he couldn't yet comprehend, he let it. The journey back to the encampment was long and grueling. As the last rays of the twin suns dipped below the horizon, a cold darkness settled over the wasteland. Dan and Lyra trudged forward, the silence between them as thick as the shadows around them. Dan found himself glancing at her more than he cared to admit. She moved with a resilience that felt out of place for someone in chains, each step steady, her head held high. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was less of a captive and more of a companion, an unsettling thought that he quickly dismissed. "You don't look away, you don't stumble," he finally muttered, more to himself than to her. "Most slaves are broken by now." Lyra's eyes caught the faintest glint of starlight as she turned her gaze toward him. "Perhaps that's because I'm not like most slaves." Her tone was calm, steady, with an edge that suggested strength forged in fire. "Is that right?" he replied, trying to suppress his irritation. "And what makes you so different then?" She stopped in her tracks, her eyes locking onto his with a piercing intensity. "Because I remember what I am," she said, each word carrying a quiet, unyielding force. "And I remember what you once were." A chill ran through Dan. How could she claim to know him? She was an alien, a stranger from a defeated world. Yet there was something unnerving about the conviction in her voice, as if she had seen beyond the armor he wore, both metal and metaphorical. He tightened his grip on her chain, pulling her forward. "Keep moving," he ordered, hoping to silence the unease that her words had stirred. But as they walked, her voice continued to echo in his mind, refusing to be ignored. They reached the encampment just as the night settled fully around them, the fires casting flickering shadows across the makeshift tents and steel walls. Soldiers watched them pass, their gazes flicking between Dan and his unusual prize. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, the kind that came with bringing an alien into the heart of a human stronghold. Dan led her to a small, enclosed space within his quarters, fastening her chain to a metal hook embedded in the wall. Lyra didn't resist, merely watching him with that same unreadable expression. As he moved to leave, she spoke again, her voice a soft murmur that stopped him in his tracks. "You've won 1,000 battles, but none of them were like this." He turned slowly, the weight of her words pressing on him. "And what would you know about battle?" She smiled faintly, a bitter smile that barely reached her eyes. "War is not only fought with weapons, Dan Harrow. Sometimes it's fought in the mind, in the heart. Sometimes it's about who holds onto themselves the longest." Dan's jaw clenched. Her words were too close to truths he'd buried long ago. "I don't need lessons on war from a slave." "A slave, yes," she murmured, her gaze unwavering, but not defeated. Frustration bubbled within him, a frustration that wasn't truly directed at her, but at the unsettling reflection she seemed to cast of himself. He stormed out of the room, letting the heavy door close behind him. But even as he tried to shake off her words, he found himself haunted by them. Later, as he sat alone in his quarters, surrounded by the spoils of countless victories, he felt an unfamiliar hollowness settle over him. He had achieved everything he'd ever been taught to value: honor, loyalty, survival. Yet here he was, unsettled by a mere captive's words. Lyra's face drifted into his mind, her calm, knowing expression piercing through his thoughts. She was a stranger, an enemy, yet she had stirred something in him that he thought long dead. A question he had buried beneath years of bloodshed and obedience. "Who are you really, Dan Harrow?" The question lingered, a quiet rebellion against everything he had accepted as truth. As dawn approached, he found himself standing at her door, unsure of what he intended to say or do. The camp was still, the soldiers asleep, and for the first time, Dan felt as though he were walking a line between worlds, his own world of obedience and hers, a world he didn't yet understand. He entered the room, his gaze settling on her as she looked up, her expression calm, expectant, as if she had been waiting for him. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Neither do you," she replied simply. And in that moment, Dan knew his life was about to change, though he didn't yet know how or why. Days turned into nights, and Dan found himself repeatedly drawn to Lyra's quiet defiance. He would bring her food, check her chains, and make excuses to stay a few moments longer than necessary. She never complained, never showed weakness, and never begged for mercy. Instead, she looked at him with those piercing eyes that seemed to see past his hardened exterior. right into the parts of himself he'd hidden even from himself. On one of those silent nights, as he sat across from her in the dim light of a single flickering lamp, Lyra finally broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what's left after all of this? After the war, the victory, the spoils?" Dan, who had never considered such a question, felt a surge of defensiveness. "This is what we fought for. The survival of our people. The power to secure our future." She tilted her head slightly, a glimmer of sadness in her eyes. "Is survival all you want, Dan Harrow? The life bound by chains, whether they're yours or someone else's?" Her words struck a nerve, igniting a strange conflict within him. He wanted to dismiss her, to reassert his purpose, yet he couldn't ignore the truth lurking beneath her question. For years, he had survived one brutal campaign after another, fighting with a single-minded focus on loyalty and survival. But survival alone had become hollow, devoid of the honor and meaning he once believed in. "You speak as if you know me," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, betraying the uncertainty that had begun to unravel his convictions. "Perhaps I do." Lyra's gaze softened. "I know what it is to live by someone else's code, to be bound by a fate chosen by others, but I also know what it's like to defy that fate." Dan felt his jaw tighten as her words seeped into his thoughts, like drops of water breaking through stone. For a brief moment, he considered her life, her people, the vibrant alien world that had once thrived before humanity's conquest. She must have had dreams, ambitions, a life beyond this wasteland and its chains. Yet here she was, surviving with the same quiet resilience he had always prided himself on. "You think defiance is an answer?" he asked, almost scoffing. "All it brings is suffering. A warrior learns to accept what he cannot change." Lyra's expression didn't waver. "And is that what you believe truly? That acceptance is the answer to everything? Or is it just easier to accept than to question?" The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Dan wanted to argue, to silence her with the force of his convictions, but he found himself unable to speak. She had seen something in him that he had hidden even from himself, a quiet rebellion, an urge to break free from the chains of duty and conformity. He had always silenced that voice, but now, under her steady gaze, it seemed to grow louder. After a long silence, Lyra continued, "When you look at me, you see an enemy, a defeated slave. But I see something more in you, a spark, a doubt. You are not like the others." Dan felt a flush of anger. But it wasn't truly directed at her. It was the discomfort of facing the truths he had ignored for so long. He wanted to reject her words, to cling to the certainty of his duty, yet he couldn't deny that her insight had pierced through him like a blade. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice rough, almost vulnerable. "Why speak to me at all?" For the first time, Lyra's stoic mask faltered. Her gaze softened, and a hint of vulnerability touched her voice. "Because you are the only one who sees me, the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm just a trophy." The admission took him by surprise, stirring an unfamiliar warmth within him. She wasn't just an enemy, a prize of war. She was a person, someone with a mind, a will, and a spirit that hadn't been broken, even under the weight of captivity. In her defiance, he saw a reflection of his own suppressed doubts, his own longing for something beyond the brutal cycle of battle and conquest. In that quiet moment, Dan felt a shift, a crack forming in the hardened armor he had built around himself. He didn't yet know what it meant, but he couldn't deny that something within him had changed. As he rose to leave, Lyra spoke one last time, her voice gentle yet resolute. "One day, Dan, you'll have to choose between the chains of duty and the freedom to follow your own path." He turned to look at her, feeling the weight of her words sink deep into his mind. "I don't have the luxury of choice," he replied, though even as he said it, he could feel the lie in his own voice. As he walked out of the room, her words lingered in his thoughts, an unyielding whisper that he couldn't silence. For the first time in years, Dan felt the faint stirrings of hope. A dangerous, fragile thing in a world that had taught him only to survive. Days slipped into a steady rhythm as Dan and Lyra continued their strange coexistence. While outwardly nothing had changed, something simmered between them. A silent understanding, an unspoken bond forged in shared glances and quiet conversations. Dan's fellow soldiers noticed his unusual behavior, their whispers growing louder, but he brushed off their curiosity, unwilling to confront the questions that haunted him. Yet, in the privacy of his quarters, the questions were relentless. Why did he feel compelled to listen to her, to hear her out? And why, of all the things he had faced in battle, did her words unsettle him more than any enemy's blade? One night, as he entered her small, dimly lit cell to bring her dinner, he found her standing by the window, her gaze distant, fixed on the stars above. The sight stirred something within him, a longing he couldn't quite place. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She didn't turn, her eyes still on the vastness of space. "Home," she whispered, "or what's left of it." Dan's heart clenched involuntarily. He had never thought of what it must be like for her, a stranger in a conquered world, cut off from everything she had once known. He hesitated, but finally found himself asking, "Tell me about it." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, but then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of memories he could only imagine. "Our world was vibrant, alive," she began, her voice a soft murmur. "Our cities were woven from the earth itself, our people connected to the stars. We weren't perfect, but we lived in harmony, not just with each other, but with everything around us." Dan felt a pang of guilt, an unfamiliar feeling he wasn't prepared for. He had been raised to see aliens as threats, obstacles to humanity's survival. But here she was, describing a world he had helped to destroy, a world that had once been full of life and beauty. "Why didn't you fight harder?" he asked, his voice almost apologetic, though he didn't know why. A sad smile played at the corners of her lips. "We did fight, but not in the way you understand. We believed in peace, in diplomacy, in reaching mutual understanding. When the war began, we thought we could reason with your people. We were wrong." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of lost hope. Dan wanted to argue, to defend humanity's actions, but he found himself unable to speak. Deep down, he knew there was no justification for the destruction they had wrought, no excuse that would erase the pain they had caused. They stood in silence, the distance between them shrinking, yet the unspoken chasm of their opposing worlds still lingered. And then, almost hesitantly, he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry," he murmured, the words foreign and difficult on his tongue. He had never apologized to an enemy before. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Hope, perhaps. Then maybe there's still a part of you that hasn't been lost," she replied softly. In that moment, Dan felt the last of his defenses begin to crumble. The world he had known, the one built on conquest and survival, felt hollow in the face of her quiet resilience, her refusal to break. She wasn't just a captive or an enemy. She was someone who had reminded him of his own humanity, the part of himself he had buried beneath years of war and obedience. A sudden knock on the door shattered the quiet intimacy of the moment, and Dan quickly released her shoulder, stepping back as a soldier entered. "Captain Harrow," the soldier barked, his tone brisk. "The council wishes to see you. Immediately." Dan nodded, a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. The council rarely summoned anyone without reason, and he had a sinking feeling that his recent behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. He glanced at Lyra, his expression guarded, and she returned his look with a faint nod, understanding passing between them. As he followed the soldier out of the room, Dan felt an ominous weight settle over him. He didn't know what the council wanted, but he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The council chamber was dimly lit, the faces of the council members hidden in shadow. They sat in silence as he entered, their expressions unreadable, yet Dan could feel the weight of their scrutiny. He stood at attention, his face impassive, though his mind raced with questions. Finally, one of the council members spoke, his voice cold and measured. "Captain Harrow, we have observed certain irregularities in your conduct as of late. Unnecessary interactions with a prisoner. Displays of empathy. Do you have an explanation for this?" Dan forced himself to remain calm, his voice steady as he replied. "The prisoner is an asset, and I have been ensuring her compliance. Nothing more." A low murmur rippled through the council, a mixture of skepticism and disapproval. "Captain," the council member continued, "your loyalty to our cause has never been in question. But recent reports suggest that your priorities may be shifting. This alien, she is a threat to everything we stand for, a reminder of the enemy we have conquered. Do not let sympathy cloud your judgment." The words struck deep, but Dan's mind returned to Lyra's face, her resilience, her quiet defiance. For the first time, he found himself questioning the path he had followed so unquestioningly, the loyalty he had given so freely. He could no longer ignore the voice within him, the one that whispered of something more, something beyond the chains of duty and obedience. "Understood," he replied, his voice steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. As he left the chamber, the council's warning echoed in his mind. He knew the consequences of defiance, yet he felt an undeniable pull toward a different path, a path Lyra had opened, one that might lead him toward freedom, even if it came at a price. The council's warning lingered in Dan's mind, an unshakable reminder of the boundaries he was dangerously close to crossing. Returning to his quarters, he felt the weight of his choices more heavily than ever. He knew the rules, knew the penalty for disobedience, yet Lyra's presence had awakened something within him, a longing for a truth that went beyond loyalty and duty. When he stepped into the room, Lyra looked up, her expression alert. She could sense the tension radiating from him, the subtle shift in his demeanor. For a moment, they just stood there in silence, the unspoken connection between them intensifying. "They're watching me," he murmured, finally breaking the silence. "They don't trust me anymore." She nodded, her gaze steady. "You've begun to question, haven't you? To see the cracks in the world they built for you." He looked away, ashamed, yet unable to deny the truth in her words. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "All my life, I've been told who to be, what to fight for. And now I'm not so sure." Lyra took a step closer, her chains clinking softly in the quiet room. "You have a choice, Dan. You can continue down the path they've laid out for you, a path of blind obedience and endless conquest. Or you can find your own path, a path that doesn't end with more destruction." Her words ignited a spark of defiance in him, a spark he had tried to bury for too long. But even as he felt that flicker of rebellion, doubt gnawed at him. "It's not that simple," he replied, his voice rough. "If I defy them, they'll brand me a traitor. They'll hunt me down." Lyra's gaze softened, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "I know the risk, but freedom often comes at a price. Only you can decide if it's worth paying." He clenched his fists, wrestling with the decision that lay before him. She was right. Freedom did come at a price. But the thought of returning to the mindless brutality of his old life, to continue fighting in a war without meaning, felt like a betrayal of the person he was beginning to discover within himself. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I help you escape, if I turn my back on everything, what then?" Lyra's face softened, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then we find a new path together, one where you're free to choose, free to be something more than a weapon in someone else's hands." Dan looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was no longer just an alien, no longer an enemy or a prize. She was his chance at redemption, a chance to break free from the chains he had willingly worn for so long. And in that moment, He made his decision. "We leave tonight," he said, his voice firm, the last of his doubts melting away. "Before they have a chance to stop us." Lyra's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope breaking through her stoic mask. "Are you sure, Dan? This isn't something you can undo." He nodded, the resolve in his heart as solid as the ground beneath his feet. "I've been living a lie for too long. It's time I start fighting for something real." As night fell, Dan prepared for their escape. He gathered supplies, slipping through the camp with practiced stealth, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He knew the risks, knew the penalty if they were caught, but the taste of freedom was too enticing to ignore. In the darkness of his quarters, he unlocked Lyra's chains, the final act of defiance that marked his separation from the life he had known. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment he thought she might doubt him. But then she reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a sincerity that made his chest tighten. "For seeing me, for choosing to fight with me, not against me." Dan swallowed, his emotions a whirlwind of relief and fear. "We're not free yet," he reminded her, gripping her hand briefly before releasing it. "We still have to get out of here." Together, they slipped through the camp, their footsteps silent as shadows. Dan's heart raced as they moved past the guards, his instincts honed from years of battle guiding them through the darkened paths. Lyra stayed close, her movements as graceful as they were determined. As they neared the edge of the encampment, a sudden shout broke the silence, and Dan's heart dropped. They had been spotted. "Run," he hissed, grabbing Lyra's hand and pulling her forward as they broke into a sprint. Behind them, alarms blared, and the sound of soldiers mobilizing echoed through the camp. They raced through the wasteland, the barren landscape stretching out before them as they pushed forward, desperation fueling their every step. Dan's mind was a blur, his only focus on escape, on getting as far away from the life he had left behind as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they found shelter in a rocky outcropping, hidden from view. Panting, they collapsed against the cold stone, the reality of their escape sinking in. For a long moment, they sat in silence, catching their breath, the adrenaline still thrumming in their veins. Then, slowly, Lyra turned to him, her eyes bright with gratitude and something deeper, something he dared not name. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You chose freedom." Dan looked at her, the weight of his decision settling over him. "It wasn't just for you," he admitted, his voice soft. "It was for me too. I was as much a prisoner as you were." Lyra's expression softened, and for the first time, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Then let's keep going, Dan. Let's find a place where we're both free." And as he looked at her, he felt the last of his chains fall away, replaced by a new purpose, a purpose he had chosen for himself. The sun rose slowly over the wasteland, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Dan and Lyra had traveled through the night, their path winding through desolate valleys and jagged rock formations. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but the thrill of freedom kept them moving, pushing through each painful step. They hadn't spoken much since their escape. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared resolve to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. But as dawn broke, they finally allowed themselves a brief respite, resting in the shelter of a rocky alcove. Dan scanned the horizon, his soldier's instincts alert despite the fatigue pulling at him. He knew they would be pursued. The council would not let a deserter and an escaped prisoner slip away so easily. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time in years, he felt alive, truly, dangerously alive. Lyra watched him from a short distance, her expression contemplative. She seemed to sense his inner turmoil, the conflict between his past loyalties and his newfound freedom. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft yet steady. "They'll come for us, won't they?" Dan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "They won't stop until they've dragged us both back, or worse." She looked down, a trace of sadness crossing her face. "I've been running from them my entire life. It's strange, but I feel safer now, here with you, than I ever did in chains." He turned to her, surprised by the quiet admission. Her words stirred something deep within him, an echo of the trust they had begun to build in the darkness of captivity. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to keep her safe, no matter the cost. "I won't let them take you," he vowed, his voice filled with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. "Not now, not ever." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes shining with gratitude and something else, something he dared not name. But before either of them could speak, a distant rumble caught their attention, a low vibration that shook the ground beneath them. Dan's heart sank as he recognized the sound. The approach of military vehicles, armored and relentless, sent to hunt them down. They had run out of time. "We have to move," he said urgently, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. They sprinted through the rocky terrain, their footsteps echoing in the early morning stillness. The sound of engines grew louder behind them, closing in, a relentless reminder of the life Dan had left behind. As they ran, Lyra's gaze sharpened, her survival instincts kicking in. "There's a cave ahead," she pointed, her voice calm despite the urgency. "If we can make it there, we might be able to lose them." Dan nodded, pushing himself harder as they raced toward the cave. The vehicles thundered behind them, and he could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, propelling him forward with a desperation he had never felt before. They reached the cave just as the first shots rang out, plasma bolts sizzling through the air around them. Diving into the shelter of the cave, they pressed themselves against the cool stone, breathing heavily as they listened to the soldiers outside. The echoes of voices drifted in, muffled by the stone walls, but clear enough for Dan to make out their intent. "Search the area," one of the soldiers barked. "They can't have gone far." Dan turned to Lyra, his mind racing. "We'll have to go deeper, if they find us here." She nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's keep moving." They descended further into the darkness of the cave, the air growing colder and the path narrower with each step. The silence pressed in around them, broken only by the distant echoes of their pursuers. As they moved, Lyra's hand brushed against his, and he felt a warmth spread through him despite the danger that surrounded them. In the dim light, he could just make out her face, her expression one of quiet determination. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a chamber at the heart of the cave, where the ceiling stretched high above them and faint beams of light filtered through cracks in the rock. They stopped to catch their breath, the tension between them thick and unyielding. "They won't give up," Dan said, his voice low. "The council will send more soldiers. We can't keep running forever." Lyra's gaze softened, her hand reaching out to rest on his arm. "Then we stop running," she replied, her voice steady. "We make a stand. Together." Dan felt a surge of resolve at her words, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He had spent his life fighting for causes he didn't truly believe in. But now, standing here with Lyra, he knew that he had finally found something worth fighting for. "Then we'll face them together," he said, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "No matter what happens." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a bond forged in defiance and trust. For the first time, Dan felt a sense of peace, even in the midst of the chaos surrounding them. He had found a purpose beyond duty, a reason to keep fighting that went beyond survival. As they prepared to face whatever lay ahead, Lyra looked at him, her expression resolute. "I never thought I'd find an ally among my captors," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you've shown me that there's hope, even in the darkest places." Dan reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "You gave me that hope too," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "Together, we'll make them see that their way isn't the only way." As the sounds of their pursuers grew louder, echoing through the cave, Dan and Lyra prepared for their stand, side by side. They had both been shaped by a world of violence and conquest, yet in each other they had found a path to something greater, a path that might lead to freedom if they had the courage to see it through. As Dan and Lyra readied themselves in the depths of the cave, the sounds of footsteps and murmurs grew louder. They were cornered, but Dan no longer felt fear, only a fierce resolve, fueled by the bond they had forged and the freedom they had chosen to fight for. The first soldier entered the chamber, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the darkness. Dan moved quickly, disarming the soldier with a swift motion honed from years of battle. Before the other soldiers could react, he and Lyra launched themselves into the fray, fighting side by side in perfect harmony. They had no plan other than to survive, to protect each other, to resist the chains that had bound them both for so long. One by one, the soldiers fell, but more entered, their numbers overwhelming. For every soldier Dan and Lyra took down, 2 more appeared. The battle was brutal, each moment testing their endurance and resolve. But as the fight wore on, Dan noticed something shifting within him. He was no longer fighting merely to survive. He was fighting to protect something precious, something that went beyond loyalty or duty. He was fighting for Lyra, for the promise of a life unburdened by the cruelty of conquest. Then, in a split second of distraction, Dan was struck from behind, the force of the blow sending him to his knees. Blood trickled down his face, his vision blurring. A soldier raised his weapon, aiming at Lyra, and in that moment, something within Dan snapped. Summoning the last of his strength, he lunged forward, knocking the soldier off balance and shielding Lyra from harm. The pain was intense, but he forced himself to keep moving, his body acting on pure instinct, driven by the need to protect the one person who had reignited his will to live. Dan. Lyra's voice broke through the chaos, filled with fear and desperation. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to stem the bleeding. He managed a weak smile, his hand reaching up to touch her face, his fingers brushing against her cheek. You have to keep going," he whispered, his voice rough. "They can't take this from you. Not now." Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head, her expression resolute. "No, Dan. We fight together, remember." In that moment, Dan realized that she had saved him as much as he had saved her. She had given him a reason to hope, a purpose beyond the empty loyalties that had once defined his life. He felt a surge of strength, a final burst of defiance as he pushed himself to his feet, standing beside her once more. Together, they faced the remaining soldiers, their bond unbreakable, their resolve unwavering. The soldiers hesitated, sensing the intensity of their determination, the strength that came from fighting not for duty, but for each other. The fighting continued, brutal and relentless, but Dan and Lyra held their ground, pushing back with every ounce of strength they had left. And then, just as the last soldier fell, a deafening silence settled over the cave. Exhausted, bloodied, but victorious, they looked at each other, the weight of their survival settling in. They had done it. They had fought for freedom, for a life beyond the chains of duty and submission. They had faced the darkness together and emerged on the other side, stronger and more resilient than ever. Outside the cave, the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, casting a warm glow over the wasteland. It felt like a new beginning, a promise of the life they had fought so hard to reach. Dan looked at Lyra, a soft smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We made it," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. She nodded, her expression mirroring his. "Yes. And now we can finally be free." They stood together in the dawn, the vast expanse of the world stretching out before them, a blank canvas waiting to be filled. They had no plan, no path, only each other and the promise of a life beyond the violence and conquest that had once defined their existence. As they walked away from the cave, Dan felt the last of his chains fall away, replaced by a new purpose, a purpose they had chosen for themselves. Together, they would build a life beyond the brutality of war, a life filled with hope, resilience, and the freedom they had both longed for. And as the sun rose higher, illuminating the path ahead, Dan knew that, for the first time, he was truly free.